And we will get started with the 7th session of this conference on the idea of the Catholic University in the 21st century. So we have two presenters for this session, and we have a substitution. So our two presenters will be Noel Adams and Jennifer Glancy. So first we have Noel Adams, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Marquette University. He received his PhD in philosophy and has written mostly on Kierkegaard and the philosophy of religion. His interests in the boundaries of rational discourse and thought are reflected in his research projects concerning paradox, ambiguity, and indirect communication. He is currently working on the historical sources of influence on Kierkegaard during the early part of Kierkegaard's authorship, as well as providing a philosophically suitable framework for approaching Kierkegaard's concluding unscientific postscript to philosophical fragments. He will be presenting a paper today entitled Serving Faith at Catholic Universities in the 21st Century, Analysis of a Pragmatic Approach Seeking Unity and Inclusion.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I wasn't here yesterday because I was still getting over an illness that didn't want to affect other people, so I apologize for missing that part. But here we go. In these early decades of the 21st century, we have become quite accustomed to hearing about identity issues and climate issues. Not only do we hear of them, many of us are in the middle of them, either as collateral damage or as leading the fight on one side or the other. So many people feel uncomfortable, even fearful, in the classroom or even in a department meeting, of being themselves or of expressing one's opinion on a topic of discussion. Our sensitivity and awareness to such issues has become heightened as the clash of values continues to unfold. News reports have brought many of these issues front and center, but not many of our leaders are willing to discuss them or able to discuss them in a fruitful manner. There is a growing reticence to discuss such topics on college campuses as well, given how much rancor arises when they're brought up. This applies also to the campuses of Catholic colleges and universities, although recent climate and identity issues are receiving more and more attention, sometimes from administrators. Although it is enticing to believe that such issues are being addressed because of their significance for a healthy campus culture, it seems in many cases that the recent concern from administrators stems from worries about legal liability. Let me be clear about what I have in mind when I mention identity and climate issues. I have in mind students and faculty who, in a classroom setting or outside of it, are fearful or very uncomfortable about expressing their views regarding marriage or sex or gender. They're worried that what they will say will be construed as creating a hostile work environment as a violation of the principles of Title IX. I have in mind students and faculty who, in a classroom setting or outside of it, are very uncomfortable about talking about their faith in God and elaborating how their faith plays a crucial role in their education and their commitment to social justice. Here, too, they're worried that what they will say will be construed by others as creating a hostile environment or being accused of harassment of some form. I have in mind faculty members who are very fearful or uncomfortable about talking about their views during departmental meetings about how potential faculty candidates for hire will be able to make a commitment to the part of the university's mission statement regarding the crucial role that the Catholic faith plays in the search for truth in an academic life on campus. They are worried that others in the department will construe this as putting forth some sort of illegal religious litmus test for job candidates. And I have in mind faculty members who are fearful or very uncomfortable about expressing their support for a potential candidate because once their views are made known, others in their department will use that information to galvanize opposition to that very candidate. In other words, what I have in mind is a toxic environment, an environment of suspicion and absence of trust, to which community members have unfortunately become accustomed as the default norm. This new norm has not come out of nowhere. There's a context out of which the new norm has grown, and to which many have responded with calls for inclusion and unity. Identity and climate issues surrounding toxic environments are nothing new, really. In fact, it was the clash of cultures and issues concerning identity, in the broadest sense, that gave rise to the Second Vatican Council over a half century ago. The Church saw a need for radical re-engagement with the secular world, and this included a renewed approach to how Catholic colleges and universities fit into its mission to engage the world in service to humanity and to God. For the Church discerned that it was not as effective as it needed to be to carry out its mission, and sought ways to become more inclusive in its search for unity in the body of Christ. The first main document to come out after Vatican II regarding how Catholic colleges and universities fit into the modern age was entitled Brevissimum Educationis, but it failed to inspire or resonate with the leading figures of Catholic higher education in North America. In response to what they took to be Rome's being radically out of touch with the conditions and reality of higher education in North America, a conference was held in Land Lakes, Wisconsin in 1967, resulting ultimately to the publication of the infamous Land O'Lakes Statement. The statement was a declaration of sorts regarding what it meant for a Catholic university to be genuine in the modern secular age. A key part of the vision of the Land O'Lakes Statement was independence from Rome in the form of complete unfettered academic freedom. As we know, the Land O'Lakes Statement drew immediate attention and ire of the Holy See, and years of responses were issued, culminating in the Apostolic Constitution entitled Ex Corde Ecclesiae in 1990. Since then, and precisely because of these two documents, the battle lines have been drawn quite distinctly and serve as a backdrop for talking about contemporary matters of Catholic identity in Catholic universities and colleges, and must be kept in mind to address the complexities involved in identity and climate issues on Catholic campuses. Identity and climate issues are often an extension of the clash between two sides, the Holy See of Rome on the one hand, and those in position of leadership on campuses at North American colleges and university on the other. The battles involved in addressing climate and identity issues are ultimately part of the overall battle regarding the question of what the proper role is for Catholic colleges and universities in the 21st century, and how that role is properly carried out. The climate and identity issues on Catholic universities and colleges cannot be understood coherently without considering how they fit into the backdrop of these two documents, or so I argue. The way in which our current leaders in Catholic higher education are trying to address our current issues are in many ways following the patterns of those who came before them. Being in a toxic work environment is something that I have unfortunately become somewhat of an expert on ever since I joined the philosophy department at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the fall of 2002. I've been a first-hand witness to all sorts of battles regarding the Catholic identity of Marquette. And I'm in a department whose dysfunction on our campus has become legendary. To call our problems at Marquette climate issues is a quite euphemistic way of putting it. The examples I mentioned previously in this paper to illustrate what it takes to be climate issues were all taken from personal experience. At the height of my despair of these issues, in the summer of 2013, I participated in a week-long retreat called Collegium, a colloquy on faith and intellectual life. What I learned from attending this retreat was that identity and climate issues were not unique to Marquette, but in fact exist in some form or another, and to varying degrees, on all Catholic campuses in North America. I also learned that there were many, many others, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, who shared my grief at these atrocious conditions and who yearned for some sort of healing through concrete plans of action. When I first came to Marquette, I was just an analytic philosophy of religion expert whose primary focus was on the thought of Søren Kierkegaard. Today, I'm that and more in the sense that I'm deeply engaged in a research project focusing on contemporary issues in higher education. These issues are now categorized under the heading Critical University Studies. Whereas most scholars in this area of scholarship adopt a purely secular vantage point for the most part, my approach is as non-secular as it gets. I take quite seriously and fully embrace the Catholic intellectual tradition as a basis for the best possible higher education. The search for truth is, in my view, fundamentally flawed if it leaves out the role of the divine or the role of the Christian faith. Now, you might think that this view would not be controversial at a Catholic Jesuit university, but you'd be wrong. Those of us who not only hold this view, but express it in the classroom and in departmental meetings are seen by many of our colleagues as putting forth views that create a problematic climate for others on campus. You might think this is astounding, especially given the fact that Marquette University's mission statement explicitly has faith as an essential component alongside of excellence, excellence, leadership, and service. Marquette's mission statement holds in part that, quote, as a Catholic university, we are committed to the unfettered pursuit of truth under the mutually illuminating powers of human intelligence and Christian faith, unquote. But you'd be astounded only if you were out of touch with some of the key details of what life is like on some, perhaps many, Catholic colleges and universities in the 21st century. The next part of this paper focuses on what those key details are and how they explain the conditions that make climate and identity issues take on the forms they have today. The final section of this paper gives an analysis of how the leaders and administrators in some campuses are appealing to a pragmatic approach when trying to deal with such details. In this section of the paper, I will identify 5 relevant factors on the campuses of Catholic colleges and universities that largely explain why the climate issues exist in the first place and give rise to a kind of toxic work environment previously described. More can be mentioned, but because of time constraints, I have to be brief. I will discuss these factors in relation to the documents mentioned previously, published shortly after Vatican II. Not only is it helpful to see how the present conditions grew out of the cultural conditions under which the Church found it necessary to re-engage with the secular world, it also helps to see the degree to which leading administrators on Catholic campuses are trying to re-engage the ever-encroaching secular culture in a manner consistent with the identity of the Catholic Church. It is, after all, an important goal of Catholic schools to become more inclusive and to seek unity. When the most recent cadre of leaders at Marquette came to town just a few years ago, for instance, they all indicated that they were aiming to revitalize the university so that a Catholic Jesuit education could be made meaningful for the needs of all students in the 21st century. And the search for more inclusion and greater unity is a crucial part of this process. The first factor to recognize is that most faculty members at Catholic institutions of higher education are no longer members of the clergy or of some religious order. Moreover, most of the faculty at Catholic institutions no longer identify as Catholic. When the aforementioned documents were first published, especially Landalic's statement and to a lesser extent Ex Corde Ecclesiae, a significant number of faculty members who carried out the day in and day out teaching and research duties at Catholic colleges and universities not only identified as Catholic, they were trained in some religious order within the Church. Now, however, the majority of faculty members are not only not from some religious order, they're not Catholic at all. And as a result, they tend not to strongly identify with the Catholic intellectual tradition or with the Church's vision of the role of Catholic institutions of higher education. Pope John Paul II, in Ex Corde Ecclesiae, was extremely concerned about this possibility. He wrote that a Catholic institution of higher education must not allow the majority of its faculty members to become non-Catholic, otherwise the Catholic identity of the school would be in danger. His worry has now become the default reality on most Catholic campuses. The second factor is that fewer and fewer administrators at Catholic colleges and universities are members of some religious order. A half century ago, when the Landalic Statement was written in response to the Church's call to engage the secular world, most of the leaders of the Catholic institutions who signed that document were trained within some religious order of the Catholic Church. They identified closely with the Catholic intellectual tradition and wanted to engage the secular world in a manner consistent with the vision of the Church, as opposed to a manner that seeks to break with the Catholic tradition. But this is no longer the case. In the last few decades, more and more Catholic universities have appointed lay presidents and provosts who have no religious training at all. Whereas many of the appointed leaders still identify as Catholic and still practice their faith, it's a very significant difference. Today, it's not uncommon for Catholic universities to be led by lay members who have not been trained in great depth regarding the Catholic intellectual tradition's philosophical and theological details. And as a result, the understanding of the significance of those commitments, the theological and philosophical commitments, of a Catholic approach to education is greatly compromised. More and more, the leaders of Catholic universities and colleges have been trained in secular universities and have set educational and institutional goals in, for example, strategic plans that take as their point of departure the goals associated and dictated by secular institutions of higher education and secular accreditation agencies that ultimately hold universities accountable. This leads to the third factor, which concerns a major shift in the educational goals of Catholic schools. More and more, what motivates the leaders of Catholic colleges and universities is to rise in the rankings of the U.S. News and World Report and to attain the highest ranking among research universities. Perhaps this third factor is unique to Marquette University, but I doubt it. Each and every year, we at Marquette do some very strange things, such as limit our class sizes to under 29 in the fall semester, but then increase them to 36 in the spring, because the U.S. News and World Report takes into account what the fall semester classes are capped at, instead of where they're capped in the spring semester. Plus, faculty members are now expected to apply for outside research money and engage in research projects that are very, very expensive, since those sorts of research projects are the ones that will raise the level of research of the school to a ranking of R1 in the Carnegie classification of institutions of higher education. Those faculty members who do not seek out extensive funding or apply for enormous outside grants will be punished economically on their yearly reviews. The prestige and the money that goes along with the classification of an R1 research university is of great concern to the leadership at most Catholic universities. It's worth pointing out that the Center for Post-Secondary Research at Indiana School of Education, which now officially runs the Carnegie classification, is a secular organization with secular values and principles. The current direction being taken by research universities is being dictated by secular organizations that have very little in common with the view of education adopted by the Church, or the Catholic universities whose identity is accordingly tied to the Catholic Church. The fourth factor is that fewer and fewer students who enroll at Catholic colleges and universities identify as Catholic. Although most students still identify as Catholic at most schools, the number is nowhere near where it was a half-century ago. And as a result, a stumbling block of sorts is placed before those who do not identify with the Catholic tradition, and those who do not identify with the Catholic conception of the role of education in relation to the advancement of the common good and the glory of God. It's no surprise that a student who does not identify as Catholic would find the climate at a truly Catholic university to be one in which they do not feel fully at home. This manifests itself quite often, both in the classroom and outside of it. The fifth factor is the skyrocketing cost of higher education, and along with it, a change in the view of what the purpose of a college degree is. The high cost of college is a severe burden on students and families, and students come to college campuses primarily with the aim of attaining a set of credentials that will enable them to get a job. Education is viewed primarily as an instrumental good, not as something good for its own sake. Given the way in which the Church views the role of Catholic colleges and universities, the purpose of higher education is, among other things, to promote the evangelization of the Church and contribute to the redemption of the world. As such, the common good is conceived of, to a great extent, in spiritual terms. Moreover, it is consistent with the Catholic view of education that a college degree has some instrumental value. However, secular students who come to our campuses conceive of the worth of the education almost exclusively as an instrumental good, specifically for economic and secular purposes, not for purposes spiritual and moral. These are conditions where not only misunderstanding, but resentment can easily arise, especially when the cost of tuition alone is $43,000 per year. That's what it is at Marquette. After all, if someone comes to a campus to get a degree so that they can accumulate wealth and gain a social reputation, and their professors go on and on about the importance of the common good and the glory of God, they will start wondering what in the world has gone wrong and why the professors are going on about all this religious stuff. These students will think to themselves that it's one thing for administrators to mention this sort of thing in some speech at the beginning of the academic school year, or even at graduation, but for this sort of thing to be woven into the fabric of a course and to be a crucial part of the course, well, that's something else. I bring this up because some of my students have lodged this complaint against me in their end-of-the-year reviews. Right? They see themselves as customers who are unsatisfied with my classroom product. Once these aforementioned factors are taken into account, it's easy to see why the identity and climate issues mentioned in the first part of this paper exist on the campuses of colleges that are Catholic. In effect, what explains these conflicts regarding identity and climate is that Catholic colleges and universities have a clearly defined vision of education in which both God and the Catholic faith play an essential role in the life of the school and in the search for truth. This vision was defined by the Church in Gravissimum Educationis and by Ex Corde Ecclesiae, and this vision is further reinforced in the mission statements of the universities that claim their identity with the Catholic Church. Then, on the other hand, you have faculty, administrators, and students who do not identify with Catholicism or the Catholic faith, and many of them even oppose the idea that God is even relevant, let alone essential, for the search for truth. Given these conditions, rather than being surprised that such identities and climate issues exist on Catholic campuses, one should fully expect them. It's one thing to identify the conditions under which these conflicts arise, but that on its own does not tell us how to solve them. In this final section of the paper, focus will be turned to how some administrators on Catholic campuses have gone about trying to solve these issues. To a large extent, I will draw on what I've witnessed at Marquette University, where the rhetoric and actions of many administrators has taken on a distinctive pragmatic approach. But I will add that from years of exchanges with my colleagues at other Catholic universities, the pragmatic tone and approach is alive and well on most Catholic campuses. For instance, one leading administrator said the following about some of the changes in policies regarding the departure from educational principles that put God and Catholic faith at the center. Quote, "I don't like it, but I have to be ruthlessly pragmatic. Otherwise our departmental interests will be harmed." Other administrators have said very much the same thing. For example, I've heard in speech after speech from deans and provosts that we must be realistic and pragmatic, and that we must focus on our actions on things that will, quote, "keep us afloat," unquote. So what does it mean to be a pragmatist? And what sorts of actions do pragmatic leaders take? To answer these questions, it will be helpful first to glance at the historical origins of pragmatism, whose roots are uniquely American. The thinkers who first put forth the principles and lines of reasoning we call pragmatism include Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. The one thing these thinkers had in common was a burning desire to break with a kind of traditional thinking that, in their view, was preventing progress. Although their concerns focused on issues and topics of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, it is their procedures and methods that are still found attractive by many today. William James, in his lectures on pragmatism, described pragmatism as a new approach for discerning the value of truth and for solving disputes, divisive disputes, while at the same time preserving some aspects of previously held theories of truth. According to James, pragmatism promises to find common ground on issues that make a practical, concrete difference in the lives of the disputants, while at the same time recognizing the differences in the commitments and principles that each side to the dispute holds. Pragmatism looks to find the cash value that comes from the truth, and this gets cashed out in a way that makes a concrete, tangible difference in the lives of those who are involved in the dispute. You can say that it's true or that it works. For according to pragmatism, these two words mean exactly the same thing. When the truth is confirmed to work, the hallmarks of verified truth include conditions that lead to consistency, stability, and flowing discourse. In addition, pragmatism acknowledges that what works in some eras simply do not work in others. What results in consistency, stability, and flowing discourse in one era is not necessarily going to work in another era if there are significant differences in the conditions. Pragmatism, thus, is both a theory of truth and a method for settling disputes about the truth. It recommends itself as a way of making progress where there is significant clash between disputants. As such, it presents itself as a very promising framework for Catholic administrators to draw on in order to settle the kinds of disputes that are the focus of this paper. What was working for Catholic universities at one point in history is no longer found to work. The tangible, concrete results of following the old models is now leading to inconsistency, instability, and to the closure of discourse. When the conditions breed frustration and isolation, and where communication is closed off, pragmatists identify them as the hallmarks of falsity. And, as we identified in the first part of this paper, the current identity and climate issues on Catholic campuses these days are thus pointed to by pragmatists as indicators that things have gone horribly wrong and are in need of correction. Given the current conditions on Catholic campuses, it's no surprise that the administrators are drawn to a pragmatic approach. In fact, it would be surprising if they were not attracted to it. Aside from the obvious appeal that pragmatism holds for those who are interested in solving disputes, it's worth looking further into some of the philosophical assumptions and presuppositions and the entailments underlying this approach. Once they're identified, it's not so clear that taking the pragmatic approach to identity and climate issues is something that administrators will be wont to do, if, at least, they wish to be consistent with the metaphysical and epistemological framework recognized by the Holy See and eo ipso with the framework underlying the Catholic conception of higher education. Let us begin by pointing out that the pragmatic conception of truth is relativistic. It is precisely this relativistic framework that allows the pragmatist to maintain that different things work for different people and that the same path won't work for everyone. What pragmatists mean when they say that different things work for different people is that different things are true for different people. The other way of putting this is that one and the same thing is not the truth for everyone. Whereas embracing a relativistic conception of the truth is not a big deal in many contexts and for many people, especially for those of us in this part of the world where we see the influence of pragmatism is set in for over a century, it is a big deal for the Holy See. The Catholic Church's official position is that relativism is one of the biggest problems facing the world today. Instead of providing a framework of fruitful solutions to the world's problems, the Church maintains that the relativistic framework of pragmatism is the principal cause of them. The encyclical letter, Fideis et Ratio, written by Pope John Paul II in 1998, makes his point crystal clear. Embracing relativism leads to agnosticism, skepticism, and an unhealthy, undifferentiated pluralism. Note carefully that pluralism is not opposed by the Church, but rather certain forms of pluralism. Anyone who has any interest in the official position of the Church on this matter would do well to read this important document. Anyone who reads it will discover that those who embrace the position of the Catholic Church and want to act in a manner consistent with it will reject all forms of relativism. Anyone who reads it will clearly understand that the Catholic approach to the search for truth will embrace a conception of truth that's universal, not relativistic, and will follow a framework that searches for the truth consistent with that conception. Clearly then, if one is to act in a manner consistent with the Catholic Church, a relativistic framework must be rejected. And given that a pragmatic approach is inherently relativistic, it must be rejected as well. Not to do so would be inconsistent with the principles of the Catholic Church. Given that there are a significant number of administrators at universities who identify as Catholic and yet abide by pragmatic principles, it is clear that they are not consistent with the Catholic underpinnings of the schools they are leading. Either they're being inconsistent knowingly or unknowingly. Either way, such leadership is unacceptable. To lead in such a manner is hypocrisy or perhaps ignorance of the highest order. We Americans might have become quite accustomed to seeing such hypocrisy and ignorance these days, especially at the highest levels of leadership, but becoming accustomed to it is no excuse for opposing it at every turn. But it seems that the pragmatic leaders at Catholic universities do not view these matters in quite the way that I've put it. Instead, they see it as a matter of having to deal with the concrete, actual problems they've inherited. Many of these problems have a pressing economic bent. They will argue that they have inherited the very problems that arise in an undifferentiated, pluralistic society that embraces relativism. They will likely point out that living in an undifferentiated, pluralistic society that embraces relativism requires one to employ pluralistic, relativistic, pragmatic principles precisely because one must do so in order to be effective in the real world. It is for this very reason, it seems, that they act in such a way that does not fully support the Church's vision of higher education. For to fully support the Church's vision of higher education is simply not something they think is any longer realistic or tenable in this pluralistic, relativistic, secular West in the 21st century. In other words, pragmatic administrators have contributed even further to a crisis of leadership that undermines the very identity of a Catholic university. What complicates this matter further is that so many pragmatists have been promoted to positions of leadership at Catholic institutions of higher education at a time when there has been a dramatic increase in the hiring of non-Catholics and secularists. It would be a mistake to identify the problem with leadership at Catholic universities to be simply a function of the increased numbers of non-Catholics on campus. There are plenty of non-Catholic faculty members at Marquette who are among the strongest opponents of secularism, relativism, and pragmatism that I've ever met. And moreover, they are also among the strongest proponents of Marquette's mission statement, especially with regards to its commitment to the divine, to the role of faith in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Moreover, there are plenty of faculty members who have Catholic baptism certificates, but who act in a manner that indicates that they have fully adopted the principles of secularism, relativism, and pragmatism, and who have completely abandoned the vision of higher education and thus the metaphysical and epistemological commitments articulated in the Church's official documents that have been mentioned in this paper. On the other hand, in my view, it is unrealistic to expect human beings to authentically and fully promote causes that they do not fully identify with. And things get even worse if they ultimately oppose those causes. It's a matter of degree. Some might strongly identify with the Church's vision, others might only marginally identify with it, and others will either marginally or strongly oppose it. These people will act accordingly if and when they become leading administrators. What these administrators of the latter ilk will do in actual practice is, on occasion, perhaps at a welcoming meeting where parents visit campus for the first time, or perhaps at graduation ceremonies, to voice some kind of vague, bland support for such things as the promotion of justice and the service to the common good. But that is about as far as they can be expected to go, for they would find it embarrassing, even offensive, to have to promote a kind of education in which the divine and the Catholic faith is front and center and play essential roles in the search for truth. Such is our life in our undifferentiated, pluralistic part of the world. But how this appeal to pragmatism, and pragmatism's relativistic framework, in any way helps to solve climate and identity issues and bring inclusion and identity and unity is utterly baffling to me. How in the world is it going to help to solve identity and climate issues at Catholic universities if we continue to promote secularists and pragmatists, the very people who oppose the Church's vision of higher education to positions of leadership? It's beyond me. It does make sense, however, if what is going on is that we are actually beginning to dismantle and abandon the vision that the Church has for Catholic universities and colleges. It also makes sense if we're willing to be inconsistent and speak as though we support the Church's vision for higher education, when in fact our actions show otherwise. And that is what's most bothersome, for that seems to be what's going on today. Our leaders act as if they have abandoned the Church's vision of higher education and have exchanged it for the secularists and pragmatists' instrumental vision. Their way of trying to solve climate and identity issues has given them away, but very few people seem to care.
Our second presenter today is Jennifer Glancy. Jennifer Glancy is a professor at the Moyne College and received her PhD from Columbia University. She is the Reverend Kevin G. O'Connell Distinguished Teaching Professor of the Humanities and the author of Corporal Knowledge, Early Christian Bodies, Slavery as a Moral Problem in the Early Christian Church and Today, Slavery in Early Christianity, and dozens of scholarly articles and chapters. Dr. Glancy is the recipient of a 2017 summer stipend from the National Endowment for the Humanities for her current research project, The Ancient Christian Understanding of Slavery and Contemporary Discourse on the Meaning of Being Human. Her research interests extend to the cultural history of early Christianity, corporeality and Christian anthropology, women's history and antiquity, gender theory, and comparative studies of slavery. At Moyne, she has been honored as both Teacher of the Year and Scholar of the Year. She co-chairs the National Steering Committee for Justice in Jesuit Higher Education, has been a member of the National Seminar on Jesuit Higher Education, and serves on several editorial boards, including Catholic Biblical Quarterly. Today, she will be presenting on 21st Century Humanities.
So at Moyne, we update our bios in August, and at that point I was still the co-chair of the National Steering Committee for the Commitment to Justice in Jesuit Higher Education, and we pulled off a big conference in Seattle in August, and I'm really happy to say it was a great conference, so thank you to my hosts in Seattle. I'm really happy to say I no longer am the co-chair, not just because I'm happy to have done it and not to be doing it now, but it was one of those things. I think we bring a project as far as we can bring it, and I'm really happy that Joe Orlando and Mike Duffy, Joe at SU and Mike Duffy at USF are working on the steering committee that I hope will be pulling off a conference at Georgetown in 2020, so stay tuned for that. I want to thank the host at Seattle. Syracuse is such a great place in March. Everyone really thought I was coming just for the weather, and that's really not true. I was really excited about what this conference is about, because in some really odd ways it gets to the heart of both my own teaching and my own current research. So I really wanted to be here. It's been nice to see blue skies, and I'm excited because I'm going to see blue skies when I get back to Syracuse, because it's dropping back to the single digits, and when it goes to the single digits, the skies go from gray to blue.
Different blue.
As a New Testament scholar whose teaching responsibilities are concentrated in the core curriculum of a Jesuit college, I share a widespread concern that the humanities are under siege, underfunded, and intellectually denigrated. These concerns should be especially pressing to those of us in Catholic higher education, given the centrality of the humanities to our institutional identities. However, although I'm going to talk about the status of the humanities in Catholic higher education, my presentation does not revolve around those widely acknowledged threats. I approach the status of the humanities from a different angle, asking how we might conceive a humanities curriculum adequate to the teaching mission of a Catholic college or university in the 21st century. Perhaps I should add that I focus primarily on teaching at Jesuit colleges and universities, both because of my own institutional location and because of the distinctive role that the humanities have played in the history of Jesuit education. Even more narrowly, I am concerned with the general education rather than with more specialized advanced study towards a major. The draft of my paper that I came to LA, in my hands, read like this. It is not my purpose to propose what the content of a 21st century humanities curriculum should be, although if you ask, I'd be happy to share some ideas on the matter. But as I listened yesterday, I thought, no, actually, I do want to tell you what I think it should be. Not exactly, but what I do want to, I sort of shifted the emphasis, which was more on formation, and I'm still going to talk about formation, not of students, but of faculty, but I shifted it a bit away from that emphasis on formation to focus a bit more on what kinds of questions I think we should be asking as we work on this process of formation together. And I say that in appreciative response to what I heard yesterday, in that yesterday I had a clear sense of there's a strong emphasis on the Catholic tradition in which we all participate. But I think if we think about the humanities in the 21st century, I'm not sure that vision that I heard articulated really beautifully yesterday and in ways that I support and would like to teach in, I'm not sure it's really adequate to the 21st century in some ways that I'm going to outline. So in some ways that I think that I'm picking up on some of the issues, Daniel, that you talked about this morning, although I think I might be coming at them from a different angle, or I guess I would say I sensed an ambivalence in your paper between we are in the ruins of humanism and the ruins of the humanities, and we are at this exciting moment in humanism and in the humanities, and I'm going to go a little bit more on the exciting moment than the ruins. Okay. So my focus is on mission-driven initiatives designed to help faculty talk together about what the humanities might become. The humanities have long been touted as serving a formative role in undergraduate education, and just yesterday, of course, Jacob Tuttle's paper, Connor Kelly's paper, both did a really nice job looking at that from different angles. I argue, in turn, that Catholic colleges have important opportunities to form the faculty whose privilege it is to teach the humanities. A healthy culture of talking together about the ends of humanities education results in the ends of, not the end of, but the ends of humanities education, results in a heightened ability to convey the heart of a Catholic Jesuit education to stakeholders, including trustees, students, and their families, a point to which I return at the end of my presentation. So I was really struck yesterday, too, and I didn't just want to beat a dead horse. It seemed to me so many of us, this was interesting to me, we're talking about precisely about different kinds of mission-driven initiatives to form faculty. Daniel Justin talking about the orientation at Regis. Jonathan Rothschild, the postdoc program at LMU, even though it's not necessarily geared towards future faculty members at LMU, still that sense of a need for that kind of training. Sacred Heart, the formation of the faculty to teach in those core seminars, and I wanted to take those training sessions to teach in the core seminars. I thought they sounded great. David Gentry Aikens, of the various programs that you talked about imagining yesterday. It also seems to me, and we were talking about programs yesterday, it seemed to me that one of the reasons that we have these kinds of programs on our campus is that in an older generation, it's not only that people came to our campuses with that kind of knowledge, but we had an informal common life that we know no longer exists. And it no longer exists not only because of increasing professionalization, but when I started teaching at Moyne in 1990, over a quarter century ago, half my life ago, we would, if there was a lecture on campus, we'd all go. And when I said we'd all go, because the Jesuits were there, and the women in my department who were former religious and unpartnered, they would go, and I went. And the married men went because their wives are home watching the kids. And various things happened, including that sometime in the 1990s, my junior male colleagues, or they were my peers then, started saying, I have to stay home with the kids. And once the men started saying, I have to stay home with the kids in the evening, when women were like, yeah, I have a life too. And so it happened like that at Moyne. I don't know how it happened on your campuses, but gradually we hired more adjuncts. I mean, we just had less of an informal common life. We weren't having lunch together. They got rid of the faculty lunchroom. A lot of things really cut down on that informal common life that we used that used to just be there organically, or so it seemed. And I also want to say, and that's good. It's good that we have some boundaries now. It really is. There were some unhealthy aspects of that lack of boundaries too. But when we think about why is there this proliferation of programs, I also think that's a part of it that we need to acknowledge in our own institutional histories. So, I'm thinking about an institution has a vocation. We want our students to come there to know their own vocations. And faculty members also have to come to terms with their own vocations of teaching in a Catholic college, and it's towards that end, it's that level of forming faculty that really, at this stage in my career, just really, really interests me. One of my favorite examples, and I'll go back to reading in a minute, one of my favorite examples of forming faculty comes actually from a large public university, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which for decades, and this only stopped for budgetary reasons about not quite a decade ago, for decades, all newly hired faculty members at UNC Chapel Hill, wherever they came from in the world, were taken on a week-long bus tour of North Carolina, and they were told, you work for the people of North Carolina. This is your mission. This is what you serve. And I'm not sure that we have always done such a good job of teaching our mission, so we need to be humbled, and we need to say, what I learned from that is we really need to convey this and make this central to what we are. Having said that, I actually do think our institutions are doing a better job with that than they did 15 or 20 years ago, so I don't mean to be negative. Okay. In some sense, Jesuit education has always been characterized by its insistence that all students should engage the humanities. When we say that the measure of a Jesuit education is who our students become, indeed hoping that they will become men and women for others, we echo a prime goal of humanistic study in early Jesuit education, which attempted to impress on students the Ciceronian dictum that we are not born for ourselves alone, and I am totally cribbing from John O'Malley there. However, as O'Malley has also observed, it would be misleading to conflate the humanities as they are studied on our campuses today with the Studia Humanitatis that distinguish the project of early Jesuit education from the curricula offered in the schools of the Dominicans or the Franciscans. The Studia Humanitatis advanced in the Renaissance, centered on philology and a classical canon, neither of which defines or is even typical of core curricula in the 21st century. Indeed, there is a yawning gap between the fixed canon and philological emphasis of a Renaissance Studia Humanitatis and the expansiveness of the humanities in the 21st century. I say that without nostalgia. Although traditional approaches to the humanities remain crucial to my own research and teaching, the 21st century requires creative thinking outside those confines. I want to be really clear what I'm saying. I am not against philology. We have a cabin, it was in my husband's family, we have a cabin in the Finger Lakes. It does not have Wi-Fi. It does not have one of those newfangled things called a flush toilet. But it does have a Greek and a Latin, a Greek lexicon and a Latin lexicon, because some things are necessary for human flourishing. And so I love philology. I'm not trying to get rid of it, but let's be honest, it really is not at the heart of what we're doing right now in our classroom, and it really probably in most cases needn't be there. You can disagree with me. So, as others have certainly noted, there's a gap between the disciplinary initiation of graduate school and the vocation teaching humanities to undergraduates at a Catholic college. And I really embrace that as my own vocation. Graduate programs are designed to groom scholars and teachers within particular academic disciplines, not to advance broader pedagogical aims of the humanities. Once again, I want to be clear, I'm not criticizing the structure of American graduate programs or calling into question the importance of disciplinary affiliation. Rather, I argue that collaborative formation opportunities on our campuses can help us imagine the humanities for the 21st century, thinking both with and beyond our disciplinary training. Such conversations should not be limited to colleagues in the humanities, as the humanities, at their best, have always been in dialogue with other disciplines. Although the tension between disciplinary specialization and broader formational ends of the humanities is of particular concern to Catholic colleges, given our teaching mission, it's worth noting that the challenge is not confined to our campuses. So I want to sort of situate our particular challenges and opportunities in a broader landscape of American higher education. Two grants programs administered by the National Endowment for the Humanities implicitly acknowledge the same tension, and both respond by funding faculty members to equip themselves to teach in a way consonant with the formative pedagogical role of the humanities. So the first of those programs was the Enduring Questions Grants Program. Defining enduring questions as those that engage people from all walks of life and transcend time and place, but are also relevant to our lives today, the NEH Enduring Questions Grants Program highlighted the formational role of the humanities in a general education curriculum. And that emphasis on enduring questions has always seemed to me really, really close to the language that we find in Moyne's own mission statement about finding meaning and value in life. The program expected faculty members to design programs of personal study to move beyond established disciplinary proficiency, implicitly acknowledging the gap between narrow cultivation of disciplinary expertise and the distinctive demands of teaching the humanities in the context of undergraduate general education. So part of what I'm drawing attention to here is because I think we sometimes lose sight of that we are part of this broader ecosystem, but there is this wider acknowledgement of this formative goal of undergraduate humanities education, and there's this broader recognition of the need for forming faculty members. The Enduring Questions program was phased out, replaced by the Humanities Connection program, which funds development of a set of linked courses taught by faculty members from multiple disciplines. And language that parallels Moyne's mission statement, language about equipping students for leadership and service in their professional lives to promote a more just society. The Humanities Connections Grants Program identifies the purpose of undergraduate study in the humanities as the preparation of students for their roles as engaged citizens and productive persons in a rapidly changing and interdependent world, a preparation said to require the skills and habits of mind that the humanities cultivate. Requiring collaboration with colleagues in other disciplines, the Humanities Connections Program stretches faculty members beyond the confines of disciplinary training in order to think in a small C Catholic way about the formative goals of humanity pedagogy and how best to achieve them. And so the construction of that particular program echoes a call to interdisciplinarity that Moyne also instantiated in its recent revision of the core curriculum, and I suspect that that kind of call for interdisciplinarity is played out in different ways on your campuses as well, and that might know that to be the case. So I don't really think that what I've said so far is going to be particularly contentious. I think that we've all acknowledged that this need that our campuses have, or there's been some widespread acknowledgement of this need for formation of faculty on our campuses to live into their vocation. What I think is going to be a little bit more contentious is focusing on what I think maybe that formation, what the content of that formation should be. And so to talk about that, I'm going to talk about a program that I'm currently administering at Moyne. In my introduction, I was identified as the O'Connell Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Humanities. One applies for that position and has to sort of put a 3-year program. You get funding, a really nice budget for 3 years. and you do programming for the faculty. And the purpose of the professorship is to enhance the humanities at Moyne, whatever that might mean. And so when I was applying for that, when I was thinking about applying for it, there was a specific moment at Moyne's campus. Again, I suspect this is a moment that will resonate with you, or at least exist at the corners of your worst nightmare, which is that we were briefly in a little hot water with our accrediting agency over, guess what? Outcomes assessment. So it turned out that we hadn't, we forgot to do it. That's not really an overstatement. So we had a year to be like, you got to do outcomes assessment. And of course, we're all scrambling around, and we did it. We pulled it off, and we demonstrated our commitment to the common good by really pulling it off in a really most excellent way, I have to say. But what wasn't excellent about it is I was really frustrated, and I knew we had to do it. I knew we had to get those papers in. But I also knew we hadn't had the kind of really open and free, we talk about, the liberal arts as freeing us. We had those parasias, the great quality of parasia, to be able to speak freely. And we had not had those kind of free discussions of what the ends of this education should be, or how particular courses might support it. It had just never happened. And by the time you get to outcomes assessment, it's too politicized, and it's too, you just want to get it done, and it's too politicized. So I thought, I want to create space to really ask about these big questions, and how I do that. How do I incentivize faculty members to take part in this conversation? And I have enough money to the incentive that I came up with is planning a faculty seminar. One will run in 2018, 2019, and the other in 2019 and 2020. And the carrot at the end is that the faculty members who are involved with the seminar, I hope to be able to bring about 8 faculty members each year, and we're not a big faculty, so that'll be a decent percentage of the faculty. At the end of the year, we will travel. The first year we'll go to sites associated with Ignatius in northern Spain, and stay tuned for year 2. So, the emphasis in this is anyone who teaches in the arts and sciences can apply. There'll be some priority given to untenured, tenure-track people, but other people, including some contingent faculty members, may be able to travel. I'd like to have some full faculty members. I don't want to be, sort of the mother goose with a lot of little, I don't want people following me around. So I'd like a couple other senior people, although I also believe that we all mentor each other, and I believe that the junior faculty members will also be mentoring each other, so it's not just sort of a top-down model. And so that's sort of talking about this question. The question that we are focusing on is this. What does it mean to teach the humanities in the core curriculum of a Jesuit college in the 21st century? And so each of those terms is important. To teach the humanities, core curriculum, Jesuit, Catholic, of course, 21st century. I would have said there was a point at Moyne's past where people didn't get that the Jesuits were Catholics, but at Moyne, I think we've conquered it. I mean, when people say Jesuit, they do understand that we're talking Catholic as well. So some of the questions that we'll be looking at, I'm pretty much, as a seminar leader, I like people to have the freedom to shape it as much as they want to shape it. So I don't have a prescribed, it's not that I'm lazy or not doing my job, but I want to create space for them to be able to put their own concerns on the table, and then take responsibility if people don't want to do that. But some of the questions that I've suggested we might look at, I think some of them are uncontentious. Why do we or should we prioritize humanities in the core? What are our goals? Enduring questions versus preparing students for positions of leadership. These are actually different goals. And what ways does the study of the humanities help us achieve those goals? How do other disciplines contribute to that? How does our disciplinary training shape views of the goals and questions of the humanities, the liberal arts? So those kinds of things, I think, are uncontentious. Here's another question I framed that we could talk about. What is the positive legacy of older traditions of humanistic study? Have those traditions limited or distorted efforts to promote human flourishing? What are the limits of some of these older views of the humanistic study? How are digital humanities and digital scholarship changing our classrooms, and again, I'm not talking about the evils of social media. How are our classrooms being transformed? The humanities, as we all grew up with them, were the result of a particular technological change, the printing press. Without the printing press, we couldn't have had the humanities as we had them. We've had some new technologies that are also going to really change the way that we pursue humanistic study. What is distinctive about the humanities in the 21st century? For example, how are our conceptions of the human and humanities affected by Darwin, modern physics and cosmology, biotechnology, digital technologies, climate change and aware of human impact on the environment, accelerating inequality, critical race theory, gender theory, human migration, the social sciences, neurosciences, Human Genome Project. And so, I'm going to try to make 3 points. I don't think we can keep teaching the humanities the way we've been teaching them. And that's one of the things I think. I don't know what the other participants in the seminar will think. Maybe they will persuade me otherwise. I'm going to make 2, maybe 3 points about how some specific ways I think that we need to be open to changing the content of the humanities. And the first of those, I was interested, I don't think when anyone was talking about the content of the Catholic tradition yesterday, I didn't hear anyone say, I might have missed it, that Laudato Si was on anyone's reading list. If it's not, consider adding it. I actually think it is somewhat, could be critical of it in some ways, but it's a really, really important document. And one of the things that we really, in the humanities, need to think about after Laudato Si is Pope Francis has repeated comments about a misguided anthropocentrism, an excessive anthropocentrism, a tyrannical anthropocentrism, and we can say in response, oh, but that leaves open, I think, the possibility, and I suspect Francis thinks, that there is a proportionate anthropocentrism. And I think our gut response is to go, oh, of course, my humanities is proportionate, But maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but have we really revisited what the humanities look like, not just in terms of climate change, but in terms of what that particular document is saying about the place of the human in the cosmos. And when we've always thought about the human in the cosmos in the Catholic tradition, it's been in the context of a particular cosmology. Our cosmology is changing in lots of ways. And so how can that not affect the content of humanistic study and of the humanities? In another document, I really hope I don't get cut off on this one, but if I do, I do. Another thing I guess I would say has to do with a word, and I'm going to use a word that's used by Arturo Sosa, who is the Father General of the current Father General of the Society of Jesus. And he used this language in a 2017 address in Brazil. He was addressing actually people who are involved in secondary education, not tertiary education. But it gives kind of a new pathway to think about humanism and humanistic study. And I take it to a challenge to everything I've ever done in my life, and I also take it to a challenge to a lot of what I heard here yesterday. He begins by giving a little brief background to the place of humanism and the humanities in Jesuit higher education. The early Renaissance Jesuits, by educating individuals' characters towards a common good, thought they were carrying out an important apostolic task, and that was meant by this humanism. He then traces humanism through Calvin Bach's iconic speech at Santa Clara, Men and Women for Others. And he says that in the present day, our situation calls for true intellectuals in the world of human and social sciences. A formulation that already, one of the things it already does, might cause us to question where we put our disciplinary boundaries around the classical humanities disciplines and disciplines in the social sciences. If we're thinking about humanism, really psychology has nothing to say to us, sociology has nothing to say to us, nothing human should be foreign to us, I think. And so I think that it causes us not to deprioritize philosophy or theology. And incidentally, it's fascinating to me that theology is consistently counted in these discussions among the humanities, because I know quite a few universities in Europe that would cross their eyes at that when you've got a faculty of the humanities and you've got a faculty of theology. So So that's even a funny fit to put theology in the humanities. But Sosa, I'm trying to go on. Sosa suggests, uses the word that he introduces that I want to call to our attention in thinking about humanism, humanities, and Catholic higher education is interculturality. And he's really clear in his address in Rio that he's not going down on that word. If you don't like that word, fine, find another one. He goes like, I'm not asking you to buy into jargon here, but he's trying to raise a larger issue that I think we also need to confront. He opposes globalization, which he says is about greater conformity. The gradual restriction of cultural exchange, he says, is parallel to a reduction of biodiversity. I thought that was a nice analogy. Instead, he chooses to talk about interculturality and universalization. Again, he doesn't want you to get hung up on language here. Understood as growing interaction among culturally diverse human groups capable of sharing a common vision of the interests of humans as a whole. And I'm now going to quote from the speech, ideally each human being or each people should feel like a part of humanity and be aware of their own culture without making it absolute. In our discussions of the Catholic tradition, we also often really come pretty darn close to making our own culture absolute. And I think that's a problem. If we define the human as Aristotle does, as I think I've got the order of the words right, monon to zon, can anyone help me? Monon to zon, ekon logon. The only living creature, not the only animal, the only living creature who has logos. That's a really important definition of the human. It's also a really Greek definition of the human. Even within our own context, I think we have to be aware that it is a limited definition. It is a definition that is tied to a Supreme Court case that is still on the books, allowing the sterilization of deficient persons because they were intellectually deficient. So I think we really need to think about this as a really important definition of the human. If we have our intercultural encounters and are transformed by them, how can we think more richly about what it means to be human, not to the exclusion of the possession of logos, but what other ways will we find about thinking about being human that will cause us to revise our own categories? I think this is what Sosa is calling us to. Anyway, this should be done critically, joyfully acknowledging the existence of other human beings with different cultures and establishing relationships of equality, enriching themselves. We can imagine that this vision of human universality corresponds to the spiritual experience of the God of Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, as a New Testament scholar, I could probably quibble with some of this wording. The church needed to overcome, not without tension, its local Jewish, Greek, and Roman horizons to step outside its cultural borders and live Catholicness as universality with local roots. Nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in our hearts. And I think that, again, when I think about interculturality, I think this is really, really hard work, and I'm not sure that we at Moyne have an ability to rethink this, given who's on our faculty. But this is a challenge to all of us, because the humanities have often been equated with the Western philosophical tradition. And that's really, really important. And how do we really think that in a 21st century in a way that does justice to Sosa's call for interculturality, not as a matter of political correctness, but because that's what it means to be Catholic. Anyway, so I could read a little more from his speech, but I guess you get the idea. I think there's intellectual excitement in such endeavors. Stay tuned, call me in a year or two, and I'll tell you how the faculty seminar goes. I predict we're going to have a great time on our travels. But actually what I've been really pleased about when I raised this, my application basically says, write me a few paragraphs to tell me how you relate to some of these questions. And as people start sending in their applications, as they say, the problem is they can't really restrict themselves to a few paragraphs, but there's so much that they want to say. There's so much that we all want to say to open ourselves into discussion with these. So I think the seminar itself, aside from the travel component, is also going to be pretty terrific. So thank you.
Well, before we
we open things up to the audience, I would like to invite our two speakers to respond to each other first, if you have any comments or questions to ask.
I'm actually really curious so I guess following up, how do we turn this on? Is it on? It's on, okay. Following up on this, when you're thinking about the Catholic tradition, I have a colleague in religious studies at Moyne, Darius Makuja, who's a Roman Catholic priest from the southern Sudan. He was a refugee himself early in his life, has a degree from St. Louis, any St. Louis people out there. He's a historical theologian, and as you could guess from someone who was a war refugee from the southern Sudan, he works on the early medieval period, go figure. But he's got to do something right. But one of the things I've learned from Darius is that when he thinks about, when he talks about Jesus in his course on Christology, it's really important for him to talk about Jesus as ancestor. And he's not only from the southern Sudan, but he's initiated into his people's traditions. He's got ritual scarification marks, which he'll be happy to talk to you about at the slightest opportunity, so I'm not like betraying some secret here. And so he has really taught me some different ways of conceiving what it would be like if we think about the gospel without speaking Greek, although he knows Greek and Latin, don't get me wrong, because Latin's better than mine is. What it would be like to proclaim the gospel in an idiom other than Greek. And I'm wondering, when you're talking about this sort of the Catholic tradition, do you have people on your campus who are enriching notions of what it means to be Catholic in this kind of Catholicizing way I'm talking about?
Well, at Marquette, we have so few discussions about what it means to be Catholic that it's really hard to respond in a meaningful way. But my own experience here with this, what it means to be Catholic, is I came to Marquette not Catholic, but over the years there was something that was said and lived that really appealed to me with regards to what it meant to be Catholic, and so I did convert to Catholicism, right? So again, I mean, I don't want it to be understood that there's no Catholic identity, or there's no one advocating for what I consider the Catholic position. But it's hard to have those sorts of conversations just once in a while, right? Once, like, someone gives a speech, someone gives a talk, and then there's a discussion afterwards, and then it's gone. Unless these sorts of things can be discussed in a really robust way to have these conversations continue, and I've heard people talk about this today, it's hard to talk meaningfully about what it means to be Catholic, and what the Catholic tradition means and has to offer. So again, I mean, Dr. Kaser earlier today said something to the effect that if you don't have people who really have lived this life of Catholicism and have an understanding of what it means theoretically and lived from a variety of perspectives, it's going to be hard to have a conversation that's not superficial, right? And Father Adolfo Nicolas a few years ago gave a speech regarding the globalization of superficiality, and it seems to me that what he was opposed to is now passes for robust conversations on campuses, and so for me, it's a matter of degree, the level of depth. Now again, maybe my philosophical training work requires me to go too much into depth, but it's just a level of degree for me.
Well, I guess we'll open it up then. Does anyone else have questions or comments for our speakers?
Thank you both. I really enjoyed and found very, very striking the ideas. And what I was, Noel, as you were speaking, being someone who, I'm Lorraine Ozar in the Greeley Chair in Catholic Education, School of Education at Loyola University of Chicago. So I've been in education, a lot of working with K-12 people, and now focusing on higher ed in where I'm going. But when I was doing my PhD in philosophy at Fordham, I studied Dewey with Johann, Robert Johann, and it was an eye-opening thing. So I have a little soft spot in my heart for pragmatism, so I'm wrestling with your characterization of the instrumental nature and sort of equating it with a relativism. And so I was sort of grappling with that as I was listening. And then, Jennifer, in your point, coming to the point of saying that we can't keep teaching it the same way we have been. So it was striking me that I think we can hang on to and ought to the reality that truth is not fixed, and to recognize and respond to truth not being fixed does not need to equate with its relative. And it was just striking me that now on some levels, and I understand what you're saying about some of the administrative moves to, take this or do this, and the reason given is, well, we've got to do it, that's how we'll keep our enrollment, that, yes, I live in that institution as well. But I think what SOSA is calling us to, and many, I think great Catholic thinkers have called us to, is that we do have to, great Jesuit thinkers, engage with the age. And so there is going to be a not fixedness to it, but I don't think that needs to catapult us into a relative, the stance that therefore it's relative. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I'm actually thinking about Nostra Aetate, and I think part of the basis of Nostra Aetate is a recognition that the Catholics and other Christians can at times learn something about the truth by looking at Judaism, by looking at Islam. That there is an access to the truth in those traditions as well. Obviously, within Nostra Aetate, keeping an emphasis on Jesus being the way, the truth, but that there is, I think there is a notion there that is consistent with what you're saying.
I wanted to clarify one thing. When talking about relativism and pragmatism on paper, I was, for the most part, going in the direction that William James took it. Right. So that's one thing I want to point out. But I also want to distinguish between what I take William James to be saying is there's a distinction between absolute truth and universal truth too, and sometimes depending upon how you conceive of these things, we maybe collapse a distinction. And the idea that I'm trying to advocate for is a view that says that there are certain principles that are true and true for all, but in different cultures, those might get cashed out in a different way, right? But I don't want to use cashed out in the way that William James does, right? Because he thinks that there's, what is true is not true for someone else, right? I mean, I take it, the way I understand Catholicism is that there is one truth, but in different cultures, it will express itself in different ways. Now, I'm not opposed to that at all, and I'm not opposed to any community that wants to be open and inviting to people who are traditionally outsiders, or at one point in a culture were condemned as deviants, right? If Catholicism is going to be genuine, it has to be for all, and so it has to be welcoming and opening for all. And one of the problems at Marquette that has really come to light over the years is just the degree to which people who identify as LGBTQ felt not a part of the community. And again, all sorts of disagreements and grumblings that happened on campus. Certain people who took Catholicism a certain way didn't want there to be any sort of offices representing these students and faculty members. But again, I'm not advocating for that sort of view of Catholicism that wants to preclude engaging people who identify as lesbian, queer, transgender, right? So again, there's a lot of complexities here and a lot of different ways to go, right? And oftentimes, I get opposed by the far right for sounding a certain way, and I get opposed by the left for sounding a certain way. So I've just become comfortable in being, not a part of any tent, right? So I don't want to give the impression that I have a certain view of Catholicism that's narrow, right? If anything, I have a view of Catholicism that identifies with Jesus of Nazareth's desire to be with the poor and the outsiders. I mean, he identified with the poor and the outsiders, right? I mean, if my students, if a student came home and said, "Oh, Mom and Dad, I'm hanging out with the drudges of society," right? Mom and Dad aren't going to be too happy about that. But that's who Jesus hung out with, right? The people who weren't privileged, right? So again, I mean, I am all for a Catholicism that embraces as many as possible. But at a certain point, well, there's certain things that can't be embraced, right? There's certain principles. So again, I mean, I'm interested in drawing the lines to see where the lines get drawn, right, and where the battles start getting fought, right? And sometimes drawing a line in a certain way can lead to misunderstanding, right? So I want to try to avoid that as best as possible. But again, it's hard to have those sorts of conversations if what people really want is a certain agenda and a certain way of doing things, right? Because we have a culture where we can't concede anything now. Right? You can't concede anything. Once you concede, you've lost it, right? So the political discourse going on today doesn't lend itself well to modeling these sorts of discussions, because the moment you concede something, right, you're weak. Right? So,
several more hands here.
Jennifer, I wanted to go to your point about humanities and social sciences, because I think this ties into some other things we've been thinking about what it is to be a Catholic university, both big and small c. And I think, I read you as kind of saying that, well, there's this problem with humanities and social sciences because some of us in the humanities don't, see the social sciences as properly part of the same project and all this. And that's, in my experience, I haven't experienced quite that tension. Perhaps I've never had a problem drawing on psychology, sociology, respecting what they do and all that, and that it has something to do with what it means to be human. But I'm wondering if, this is one area where Catholic education can help us at bridging some of these differences. I find it often, the tensions often come in, I don't want to say the other side, I don't want to throw the social side, but when it comes to this question of what it means to be a scholar, right, you get into tensions, especially, I remember at the beginning of the year at our school, there was a panel on undergraduate research, for example, and where people from the humanities who went and tried to raise questions about undergraduate research were kind of told, well, what your students do is not really research because it doesn't produce data. There's nothing original, right? If they write a great paper on some novel or whatever, that's not research because that's not new, that's not data. They didn't do anything the way you would do by doing a survey or an experiment. So I see these tensions coming up in this kind of thing. What does it mean to be a scholar, or what it means to produce research and all this? And I'm wondering, since you brought this issue up, if you think that there's a way that something like what you're doing, or the atmosphere of a Catholic university as, seeking ways of thinking about what it means to be human can help bridge some of those things.
I think there's a way with I think there's a problem with the way that the United States currently conceives of undergraduate research, and I think this is true at Moyne. I taught for 2 years, from 2008 to 2010 at University of Richmond. I saw it there. I think I've known it's a problem in other institutions. One of the problems is that doing original research in the humanities actually does take, if someone's first reading of a novel, actually,
right. Well, no, this is
probably
yes.
no. But so that's an issue. So how do you
Yeah.
get to the point where there's something publishable
Right.
as opposed to I'm doing a
Yes.
research project and it involves bringing people into a lab situation
Right.
and I'm going to have the students, the second, third, and fourth
Yeah.
authors on it, and that's
Yeah.
great, and I support that. But I do think part of the problem there has to do with the way we construct undergraduate research funding and festivals and everything else. I do think, I guess I'd say, and so part of it I would say, I say to my colleagues right now, who are asking me, is this seminar right for me? Well, how are you going to enter into it? So it's how we're going to draw boundaries. It's how people want to draw boundaries around themselves. Within, I would say, most of the social sciences, there are approaches that more or less open to what I would think of as interpretive, that there's something that's about interpretation that's at the heart of the Humanities project. And so a colleague of mine who is a political scientist, she's a political theorist. Tell me how she's not in the humanities. I mean, she's in a political science department, and yet if you looked at her work, she's, she uses some strange jargon sometimes, but don't we all? So I think it really, I think it's a question to, I guess I'm going to say, I think the disciplinarity is really important, but I think it can also be false. And so I guess I'm calling attention to that. Not both what the humanities can learn from their encounters with that, but also sometimes how we say who is in and who's out. And actually, really, I do go back to Sosa's talk, the human and social sciences, and that I think what he is suggesting is that within Jesuit higher education, sort of a call to humanism is going to really require some engagement with the social sciences. Does that?
I'm sympathetic to that. Yeah, again, I guess what I've been raising is sort of that this issue can come up in sort of different configurations. That, again, in terms of what constitutes research, undergraduate research, of course, is its own thing. But I think sometimes there's these misunderstandings of what we do in our various disciplines and how they contribute to that. Okay. Especially if you've been formed in a relatively narrow sense, to conform to your own discipline, whatever that may be.
Absolutely. I could go on. I've chaired rank and tenure committees to every candidate. It is your responsibility to educate your committee about what's going to count, so that this two across the board.
I was really intrigued by that conversation around the nature of truth. And it just reminds me of the philosophical principle that truth is not the same as certainty, right? So it's one thing for me to believe that truth exists. It's quite another thing for me to believe that I possess it entirely and am empowered to act on it, right? About 20 years ago, the theological journal Concilium did a great issue, and the key to the whole volume is in the title. It was called Truth and Its Victims. I mean, it says it all, right? That if I come to what the deconstructionists would call premature closure about what truth is, then that's very dangerous, right? I mean, as a Catholic, I can say I believe in the incarnation, that God is fully, that Jesus is fully God and fully human. I can't tell you that I completely understand what that means, right? Or I can say I believe in the Trinity, but I can't say I completely understand what that means. And perhaps, over the course of a lifetime, I grow in my understanding, but I never reach the point that I can say I possess it entirely. So I just thought that was a very interesting.
Wittgenstein has a little work called On Certainty,
yes.
and my husband, when I'm sounding particularly certain, because I can sound very certain, my husband will look at me and say, certainty is an attitude. So it's not like that guarantor of anything.
Right. And I was also going to say, at DePaul University, there's some interesting work being done there on this concept of world Catholicism as something that sort of transcends Euro-American definitions of Catholicism.
And so I think, I would even say it goes beyond that, and I'm going to get a little bit outside of the Catholic tradition. Now, does anyone know the great playwright Shoyinka, I'm saying, butchering his name, he's a Nobel laureate, and maybe you'd see it if you wrote it, because I can't say anything. He wrote, his greatest play is Death and the King's Horseman. But around 1980, he was invited to teach for a year at Oxford, and he said he was going to lecture on African literature. And they said, oh, you can't do that in the literature department, you have to do that in the anthropology department. And I mean, I'm like, I mean, think about it, and so much of the humanities have been about the self-understanding of Europe, and I'm part of this tradition. I cannot tell you how deeply formed I am in this tradition. Our problem, I think Sosa is saying, is when we take that to be universal, or we think that we don't have anything to be transformed, that our categories are not going to be transformed when we encounter people from the global south, or when we encounter people from China, or when we encounter people from India, cultures that have really rich traditions that might ask us to reframe some of our own starting points.
Yeah, one thing I just add is with regards to certainty. Most of my research has been on Soren Kierkegaard and certainty and his conception of faith, right? So I identify with that, right? I agree that those who think they have the whole truth and are closed off to being open to are in for either a very uninteresting life or the kind of life that I wouldn't want to live.
They become very dangerous demagogues.
Yeah. Right. And a lot of people, they think they have the truth, right? Those are grounds for or conditions under which I think all sorts of abuse could and would arise. So again,
I think it's important especially with students, to say one can hold out that truth exists, as opposed to a nihilistic position, but not that one possesses that truth in its entirety.
Well, we have about 1 minute left, so maybe time for one quick question. There's a hand in the back waiting.
This is a substantive question, so it may need to wait for a discussion later. But thank you both so much for your papers. And I was struck, as you both spoke, about a theme that has been coming up, I think, consistently over the course of these past 2 days, and that is the centrality of community to a Catholic university. And Jennifer, thank you so much for your observation about the decline of common life. And it strikes me that various pressures, specifically mostly economic pressures, have really mitigated against the common life of the university, particularly among the faculty. And it seems to me that nurturing some sort of a common life would address both of your endeavors, in that having substantive conversation in terms of disagreement requires an assumption of good faith on the part of one's interlocutor, and that usually comes in the context of a personal relationship. In the same way, true interculturality requires a genuine encounter with the other and a sense of mutuality and personal relationship. So my question would be, do you think it's possible, both of you in your various points of emphasis, is it possible to achieve those ends in the absence of common life? And if not, how can common life be fostered?
So I guess I'd just say real quick, amen. I mean, I was going to pick up Paul Monson's language of the we, and the question of how we nurture the we, keeping in mind that we're not all going to be domiciled in the same place, eating common meals together. Right, so, and I guess I think that you framed the issue the way it is, and I would say it's going to happen really different on our different campuses. Moyne is not that big a campus. Some people live really far from Moyne. They might have to drive, half an hour to get there. I'm joking. We do have faculty members who live further away than that, but if you want to live close to campus, believe me, you can get a house for cheap. We have like adjuncts who live on their adjunct wages who buy houses at Syracuse. So it might be falling apart, and they might not be able to heat them. But so I think it really varies according to the kind of campus we are, and so I think that would need to be campus specific.
Yeah, I seem more skeptical. I can't help it. I come from poverty, and if you come from poverty, there's a certain way of viewing the world that isn't open to you, and with the way that the poor are treated today, and with the way that wealth is becoming more and more in the hands of fewer and fewer people, those sorts of issues are becoming worse, as I see it, right? And technology plays a role, and other things play a role. It's hard to get a sense of community where the sort of inequalities, not just economic, but economic too, it's hard to have a sort of healthy community where the inequalities that we see are just getting more and more robust.
I wouldn't want to challenge that. I have to say one more thing about Lemoyne. Lemoyne is not Nirvana. I mean, I can tell you, I can give you a long list of bad things about Lemoyne if it'll make you feel better. But the person, I have the O'Connell Distinguished Professorship, as we also heard before. 4 years ago, the woman who was just getting over her term was a woman named Mara Brady, and what she had done with it was a project in terms of actually putting together a little book where faculty members wrote a story why we do what we do. Like, it would be really interesting to hear why we do what we do from your perspective or from a number of other perspectives we've heard. And when she gave her sort of you get the final chance to talk to the faculty, and she said something that I started to cry and I looked around and other people were crying. But she said, as I worked on this project, what I kept realizing was how much the Lemoyne faculty loves each other. And I brought tears to my eyes because there's something really true about that. And so that may just be a weird kind of freak thing about Lemoyne, but there it is. So it can exist sometimes in some places.
Well, I hate to cut this off, but let's thank both of our speakers for a great